Most teams played hockey. The Soviets played war. They didn't send athletes. They sent soldiers. College kids on one side, a superpower on the other. They called it a massacre waiting to happen, and the world believed them. But one crazy coach knew something nobody else did. And the game he was about to build toward? It almost triggered World War III. The Soviet Union arrived at Lake Placid in February 1980 with a record that made professional teams look amateur. Over the previous 4 Olympic tournaments spanning 1964 through 1976, they had gone 27-1-1 and outscored their opponents 175-44. 4 consecutive gold medals hung around their necks, and no team had beaten them in an Olympic game since 1968. These weren't students playing between classes or workers skating after shifts. The Soviet hockey program operated as a military function funded by the Kremlin, and every player on the roster trained 11 months each year under state supervision. The Red Army didn't produce athletes. It manufactured weapons on skates. At the center of this machine stood Vladislav Tretiak, widely recognized as the best goalie on the planet. He had already won gold medals in 1972 and 1976, and at 28 years old, he was entering his prime, with reflexes that made scoring against him feel like an accident rather than a strategy. The Soviets had outscored their Olympic opponents by massive margins in recent years, turning international competition into exhibitions of dominance rather than contests. When Soviet coach Viktor Tikhonov looked at the bracket for Lake Placid, he made his assessment clear to anyone listening. It will be a massacre. But the ice rink in upstate New York represented more than athletic competition. The world outside the arena was coming apart. The Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan 2 months earlier in December 1979, reigniting fears that the Cold War was escalating beyond control. In Iran, 52 Americans remained hostages on the 102nd day of captivity when the Olympics began, a daily reminder that American power had limits. Inflation crushed family budgets while unemployment climbed and gas lines stretched around city blocks. The United States needed a victory somewhere, and the Kremlin knew that every gold medal won on international ice reinforced the narrative that communism worked better than democracy. Hockey became the battlefield because the Soviets had perfected it. Their players moved like synchronized machinery, executing plays that demonstrated years of collective training under a centralized program. American hockey, by comparison, looked fragmented and underfunded, relying on college programs and individual development rather than state resources. When the matchup was announced, no serious analysts gave the United States a legitimate chance. The Americans had no chance, unless one crazy coach could pull off the impossible. Herb Brooks had watched the 1960 Olympic team win gold from his living room after being the last player cut from that roster. 20 years later, when the Olympic Committee needed a coach, Brooks made his pitch simple. Give me 6 months and players nobody wanted, and I'll beat the Soviets at their own game. The committee thought he was insane, but Brooks had spent a decade studying Soviet hockey with the focus of a man preparing for war. He knew their conditioning methods, their relentless puck possession strategy. His plan wasn't to out-talent them, it was to outwork them, using their own blueprint against them. Brooks selected 20 players with an average age of 21, making them the youngest American Olympic hockey team in history. The Soviets averaged 26 years and 5 months old and had been playing together for years. He administered a 300-question psychological test to 68 candidates, searching not for the most skilled players, but for the ones who would sacrifice everything when the moment required it. Mike Urazzoni became captain despite having no professional future ahead of him, a working-class kid from Massachusetts who understood that this tournament represented the peak he would never reach again. Jim Craig played goal while carrying the weight of a promise made to his mother, Margaret, who had died from cancer in 1977 and never got to see him represent his country. Mark Johnson arrived as the coach's son from the University of Minnesota, which meant every mistake would be judged twice as harshly and every success dismissed as favoritism. Brooks had a philosophy that confused everyone who heard it. I'm not looking for the best players. I'm looking for the right ones. Training camp became a controlled breakdown of every assumption these players held about hockey. Brooks introduced a drill that became known as Herbies after the team played without intensity during a practice session. He lined them up and made them skate end-to-end sprints until players collapsed and vomited on the ice. The drill didn't stop when they begged. It stopped when Brooks decided they had learned that effort was non-negotiable. His assistant coach warned him that players were going to mutiny if he kept pushing this hard. Brooks smiled and said, "Good, let them hate me together." He was building unity through shared suffering, forcing 20 individuals from rival college programs to become a single organism that moved faster than the Soviets expected Americans could move. The players hated him, but somewhere in that hatred, they started believing in each other. 3 weeks before the Olympics, Brooks had one final test waiting. On February 9, 1980, the United States faced the Soviet Union at Madison Square Garden in their final exhibition game before the Olympics. The Soviets destroyed them 10-3 in front of 11,241 spectators who watched Soviet players laugh on the ice while Tretiak stopped shot after shot like he was playing against children. Vladimir Krutov scored 3 goals. Jim Craig got pulled after allowing 4. The American media ran headlines asking what kind of lambs were being sent to slaughter in Lake Placid. Everyone left the arena convinced the upcoming matchup would be unwatchable. Everyone except Herb Brooks, who walked out of Madison Square Garden smiling. In the locker room afterward, Brooks told his confused players exactly what had just happened. "We just showed them exactly what they expected to see." Brooks had instructed the team to play slow, predictable, and tired, to reinforce every assumption the Soviets held about American hockey being inferior. The trap was set. The Soviets would arrive at the Olympics overconfident, expecting the same plotting American team they had embarrassed. Brooks kept the real strategy closely guarded to ensure the secret stayed contained. At the Olympics, the Americans would go full chaos and skate the Soviets into exhaustion. Speed over strength. Relentless pressure over careful positioning. Everything the Soviets had just watched was a lie. The Americans entered the Olympic tournament as the 7th seed out of 12 teams. They opened against Sweden and trailed until the final seconds when they tied the game 2-2, salvaging a point that kept them alive. 2 days later, they demolished Czechoslovakia 7-3, shocking observers because the Czechs were considered the 3rd best team in the world. While the Americans were quietly climbing, the Soviet camp was growing fat on dominance. They had cruised through their own group, outscoring them 51-11 across 5 games. Tikhonov watched the American results scroll in without concern. When someone in his camp flagged that the Americans looked dangerous, he dismissed it with a wave. "Let them have their fun. We'll handle them on Friday." The Soviets weren't preparing for a fight. They were preparing for a formality. February 22, 1980 arrived with 10,000 Americans packed into the Olympic Fieldhouse at Lake Placid. The Soviets brought their A-team, the same lineup that had humiliated professionals and dominated international hockey for over a decade. Tretiak stood in goal. The 5-man attack that had perfected puck possession took the ice. They had no idea what was coming. The Soviets scored first at 9 minutes 12 seconds when Vladimir Krutov deflected a shot past Jim Craig. The arena went quiet. Then the Americans revealed what Brooks had been hiding. They skated relentlessly, never stopping, rotating lines faster than the Soviets had ever seen from an American team. Buzz Schneider tied it at 14:03 with a shot that made Soviet defensemen turn and look at each other in confusion. This wasn't the team from Madison Square Garden. The Soviets answered when Sergei Makarov scored at 17:34, restoring order. But with 1 second remaining in the first period, Mark Johnson pounced on a rebound and tied the game 2-2. The arena exploded. Soviet coach Viktor Tikhonov made a decision that stunned everyone watching. He pulled Vladislav Tretiak, the best goaltender on the planet, and replaced him with backup Vladimir Mishkin. The Soviets left the ice rattled for the first time in years. This was the moment the game shifted from a hockey match into something else entirely. The second period was where the Americans proved the conditioning was real. Alexander Maltsev scored at 2:18 on a power play, making it 3-2. The Soviets had the lead. But Brooks had built this team exactly for this moment. Down, under pressure, with tired legs on the other side. Jim Craig became a wall. 15 saves in the period. The Soviets fired everything at him and nothing went in. Soviet players started yelling at each other as the Americans hit harder and skated faster than any team trained for 11 months should have been able to handle. The conditioning wasn't just working, it was breaking them. The third period began with 20 minutes separating the Americans from history. At 8:39, Mark Johnson tied it 3-3 on a power play. The momentum shifted completely. At exactly 10 minutes remaining, Mike Urazzoni picked up a loose puck at the blue line. He had never scored in a clutch moment before. He fired a 25-foot wrist shot that beat Michigan clean. The United States led 4-3. Now came the part nobody talks about. 10 minutes on the clock. The Soviets pulled their goalie and threw everybody forward. Jim Craig had to stop 6 desperate shots in the final 5 minutes. Not just saves, but bodies crashing into him, sticks swinging, chaos on every possession. The crowd began counting down the clock. 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. The horn sounded. Al Michaels screamed into his microphone.
You believe in miracles? Yes!
Players piled on Craig. He looked up at the sky, thinking of his mother, who had died in 1977 and never got to see this moment. Americans in the stands wept and chanted, USA, USA, while the Soviet team skated off in silence. An empire had just cracked on live television. Brooks wasn't celebrating. They hadn't won gold yet, and he knew they could still destroy everything in 2 days. 2 days after beating the Soviets, the United States faced Finland for the actual gold medal. The team had spent the night celebrating, and several players showed up to the arena hungover and unfocused. Finland capitalized immediately, taking a 2-1 lead into the third period while the Americans played as if they had already won. Brooks erupted during the second intermission, screaming at his team, "You're blowing it!" The locker room went silent until Mike Urazzoni stood up and delivered the line that saved everything. "We beat the Soviets. Let's not be remembered for losing to Finland." The Americans scored 3 unanswered goals in the final period and won 4-2. Only then, on February 24th, 1980, did they become Olympic champions. President Jimmy Carter had been watching the game live from the White House on the 110th day of the Iran hostage crisis. The next day, Carter addressed the nation and said, "Americans can do anything," using the hockey game as proof that the country had not lost its ability to compete against impossible odds. American morale transformed overnight in ways that policy speeches and political promises had failed to achieve. The hostage crisis still felt hopeless, but for the first time in months, people believed that hopeless situations could be overcome. The Soviet Union responded by blaming referees and overhauling their entire hockey system, a tacit admission that their symbol of superiority had been exposed as beatable. Soviet media struggled to explain the loss, with one newspaper suggesting the defeat came not from inferior players, but from something harder to measure. Sports Illustrated put the team on their cover with the headline that would become permanent, "Miracle on Ice," and later named it the greatest sports moment of the 20th century. The players returned to normal lives that proved the moment mattered more than what followed. 13 went to the NHL, and most had mediocre professional careers. Mike Urazzoni never played another competitive game, walking away at the peak because nothing could top that moment. Jim Craig carried a folded American flag onto the ice after the gold medal game, a tribute to his mother Margaret. Herb Brooks went on to coach in the NHL before dying in a car crash in 2003. What separated this team from other Olympic squads became clear at their reunions. 20 or more players still show up decades later, while most Olympic teams fracture and fade. This wasn't a sports story. It was a Cold War turning point disguised as a hockey game. The Soviet Union collapsed 11 years later. Did hockey cause it? No, but it revealed that cracks could form in systems that appeared invincible. And it showed the world that belief could defeat structure when the moment demanded it. The real miracle wasn't the score. It wasn't Jim Craig's 36 saves, or Mike Urazzoni's goal, or Herb Brooks' strategy. The real miracle was 20 kids who refused to accept what everyone told them was impossible. That's how Olympic hockey became a Cold War weapon. and how belief became America's greatest export. They beat the Soviets. Then they had to beat themselves. Then they had to live with being the generation that proved miracles could happen. Most of them never reached those heights again. That was never the point. The point was showing an entire country that impossible was just another word for not yet. Hockey gave America a weapon that day. Not violence, not fear, belief. If you want stories that don't protect reputations or rewrite history, stories about the moments that changed hockey and the world around it, subscribe to Skates and Scars. We tell the game exactly where the league stops talking.